Throughout history, some of the darkest figures have been executioners, but not all have followed the typical practices of capital punishment. Some went far beyond the norm, employing gruesome and disturbing methods that would shock even the most hardened minds. Vlad III, or commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, is remembered as one of the most brutal and terrifying figures in European history. Born in 1431, he ruled as the Prince of Wallachia in modern-day Romania. While his military and political ambitions were complex, it was his savage methods of punishing his enemies, and even his own subjects, that truly earned him a place in history's darkest chapters. His nickname comes from his horrifying signature execution method, impalement. Vlad the Impaler became infamous for using impalement as a form of execution. But this was no ordinary execution. Victims were typically forced to kneel and were then impaled through the rectum or vagina, with the long, sharp wooden stake often exiting through the mouth or neck. These stakes were sometimes so large that it could take hours, even days, for the victim to die. Why was this so brutal? Well, the pain was unimaginable. Impalement was not an instant death. Victims would suffer slow, agonizing deaths from shock, infection, or internal bleeding. Many died after several hours or even days, their bodies slowly losing strength as they were left to hang helpless on the sharpened stakes. The sheer terror and helplessness of those who were impaled, combined with the public spectacle of the executions, made it a tool for mass intimidation. Vlad's cruel methods weren't just about punishing individuals. They were about sending a message to everyone who dared oppose him. The psychological toll of witnessing such executions was profound. Victims were often chosen at random or for minor infractions, which added an element of fear for everyone living under Vlad's reign. People lived in constant terror, knowing that one wrong move could result in a similar fate. Vlad's brutal punishments earned him the title of a tyrant and a monster in the eyes of many. He is believed to have impaled as many as 20,000 people during his reign. His legacy left behind a chilling reputation that inspired the Dracula legend, as Bram Stoker's fictional vampire Count Dracula was partially based on Vlad's ruthless persona. But in reality, Vlad's punishments were not just stories, they were real and had a lasting impact on the people of his time. The Spanish Inquisition, a religious institution that began in the late 15th century, was responsible for some of the most disturbing forms of execution ever seen in the Western world. Although not a single individual executioner, the inquisitors and their methods left a legacy of unimaginable suffering. Operating under the authority of the Catholic Church, the Inquisition's goal was to root out heresy and enforce Catholic orthodoxy, but they didn't shy away from brutal tactics to achieve that goal. The Inquisition is infamous for its use of torture and execution, and one of its most disturbing methods was burning people alive at the stake. This was typically reserved for those accused of heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft. The condemned were tied to a stake, often in front of a crowd, and then burned to death. But burning wasn't the only horrific method. Many victims were subjected to horrific torture before their execution. The infamous rack, where victims were stretched to the point of dislocation, was one of the most common tools of torture. Some were strapadoed, meaning they had their arms tied behind their back, and were then hoisted into the air by ropes, dislocating their joints. Another brutal method was the waterboarding technique, where victims had water poured into their mouths to simulate drowning, causing extreme panic and suffocation. Why was this so brutal? The psychological terror and physical agony inflicted on victims were unparalleled. Those subjected to these punishments didn't just face physical pain. They were also forced to endure intense psychological torment. The very nature of the Inquisition made it a terrifying experience. The Church was meant to be a source of comfort. Yet under the Inquisition, it became an instrument of unimaginable suffering. The fear created by the Inquisition was pervasive. The mere suspicion of being accused of heresy or witchcraft could lead to months of torture, even if you were innocent. The pain was unbearable, and often the victims' families and communities were also ostracized. Burning alive, in particular, was a public execution meant to display the power of the Church. The slow, agonizing death was intended to serve as a warning to others. The Spanish Inquisition ended in the early 19th century, but its legacy lives on in history as one of the most horrific instances of religiously motivated violence. It is estimated that between 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed, but the true number of victims who suffered in torture chambers is likely far greater. The sheer brutality and religious zealotry of the Inquisition set the stage for centuries of fear and superstition, and to this day, it stands as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was one of the most turbulent and violent periods in European history. Amid the chaos, executioners rose to prominence for their brutal methods of carrying out capital punishment, with the most infamous being the use of the guillotine. While the guillotine itself became a symbol of justice in revolutionary France, its frequent and widespread use, as well as the methods of execution during this period, left a legacy of horror. The guillotine was designed to be a swift and humane method of execution, at least in theory. However, it became a tool for mass executions during the Reign of Terror. Under the leadership of figures like Maximilien Robespierre, thousands were executed in quick succession, many of them for nothing more than political disagreements or accusations of being enemies of the revolution. Victims were often paraded through the streets in carts, blindfolded and awaiting their fate. They were then strapped to the guillotine, where a heavy blade would fall, severing the head in a single, swift motion. While this method was designed to be quick, the sheer volume of executions and the public spectacle surrounding them added an element of psychological terror. Why was this so brutal? While the guillotine itself was efficient, it symbolized the bloodlust of the period. It wasn't just the method of execution, it was the sheer scale of violence. People were executed not just for real crimes, but often for perceived slights, or because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Entire families were wiped out without a trial, and the streets of Paris became a blood-soaked backdrop to the revolution's chaotic descent into terror. The psychological impact of the Reign of Terror was immense. Citizens lived in constant fear of being accused of counter-revolutionary activities. The guillotine became a symbol of the paranoia that gripped society, with thousands fearing that they could be next, often without any actual wrongdoing. The brutality of the period left an indelible mark on the psyche of the French people, as fear and distrust ran rampant. Though the Reign of Terror ended with the fall of Robespierre in 1794, the legacy of mass executions and the guillotine would linger in history. It represented not only the extremes of revolutionary justice, but also the dangers of mob rule and unchecked power. The guillotine itself became a symbol of the revolution, yet it also serves as a chilling reminder of the brutality that can arise when fear and suspicion take hold of a society. The French Revolution left a profound mark on the world, showing just how quickly justice can devolve into violence when the line between law and chaos becomes blurred. As we look back on these executioners and the horrific methods they used, it becomes clear that the history of punishment is not just one of justice, but of cruelty, fear, and terror. From Vlad the Impaler's slow and torturous impalement to the Spanish Inquisition's relentless use of torture, and finally, the French Revolution's bloody reign of terror. These figures stand out as some of the most brutal in history, not because of their individual actions, but because of the systems of fear and violence they helped create. In the end, these executioners didn't just take lives, they destroyed the spirit of entire societies, leaving behind a legacy of suffering and paranoia that still echoes through history. Their actions remind us of the depths to which humanity can sink when power is abused and when cruelty is used as a tool of control. But what does this mean for us today? As we continue to reflect on these dark chapters of history, we must remember that the horrors of the past should never be forgotten, but rather serve as a reminder of the importance of justice, humanity, and compassion. So next time we think about punishment, we should ask ourselves, have we learned from these past mistakes, or are we doomed to repeat them